For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. You are on our daily evening program, The Gist. I'm Nitin Gokhale. On the gist this evening, I'm going to be joined by Rear Admiral Sudarshan Trikhande, a well-known face on Strat News Global and a strategic affairs analyst who works across the various spectrums to not only teach but analyze and write on operational art of war, the issues of the dime paradigm in the strategic affairs, and of course watches what happens across the world. Today, I'm going to talk to him about the Ukraine war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine 1 year later, and the military aspects of it, or the things that have gone wrong or right for both the sides, both Russia and Ukraine. Welcome to this program, Sudarshan, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Nitin. Always a pleasure.
Uh, 1 year later, there have been lots of literature now being churned out about the war in Europe, the war on the Ukrainian soil, and why Russia launched what Russia calls special operations, others call it war, and what prompted this move by Russian President Vladimir Putin are being discussed threadbare everywhere. But one of the aspects that has been less focused is the lack of planning, apparent lack of planning on the part of the Russians while launching this operation, which showed up in the initial months, and of course now we are seeing it 1 year later. That perhaps the objectives with which the operation was launched has not been achieved. Your thoughts on that, and why planning or even thinking about war before it is launched is extremely important.
Uh, yes, I agree with you. It does seem that there were gaps in planning. Probably decisions were taken hastily. Uh, this is surprising. Of course, there's a bit of a contradiction there because certainly the invasion or the start date, etc., were choices made by Russia, and therefore, if you're making choices, you need it. It can be assumed that you had the time to plan, the time to think deeply, and thereafter look at how policy objectives are to be met through military strategies, but also through the entire sort of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic strategies, including what the adversaries might do. So I do see room for a lot of skepticism, that planning should have been much better by the side initiating. For that matter, I would say that planning has to be also of a deep order by countries that are surrounded by adversaries. In this case, sort of Ukraine. It seems to me that in hindsight, one can say with the way Ukraine uh, took up the initial blows and reacted quickly, also meant that in the interim between 2014 and now, they had learned some lessons, made some preparations, anticipated certain moves and certain operational factors and strategies that the Russians might employ. And to that extent, the initial sort of setbacks from the Russian point of view might have been attributed both to less than adequate planning on the Russian side and perhaps a higher degree of planning on the Ukrainian side, which seemed apparent with the way they could parry some of those blows.
Indeed. In fact, I wanted to take you back to your own writing. You wrote a sort of piece in one of the newspapers highlighting the lack of planning, or what could have been done better by the aggressor, that is Russia here. And I've talked about how it can be improved by nations trying to understand that what they need to achieve. And I think you wanted to say, in sum, that the long myth of short wars is actually a myth. So, if you can explain the importance of operational art, as well as why nations go wrong in anticipating the end of the war. I mean, the initiation can be there, but the end of the wars can never be predicted. So, if you can elaborate that a little bit for our viewers.
Yes, I think many people have said, one doesn't know who said it first, that wars are easy to start, they are very difficult to end. But nonetheless, it seems almost axiomatic. It might even be a truism. And surprisingly, the history of warfare, even recent wars started by the larger powers or great powers, also show that the initiator, being the larger of the powers, often does well tactically in the beginning, does well maybe tactically almost throughout the duration, and yet loses strategically. The a great power like the Soviet Union faced it in Afghanistan in the in the 1980s. Before that, Vietnam, saw the same thing happen to the US. And in many ways, a great power like the US has had these similar reverses in Afghanistan as well. So the side that initiates a war does not necessarily come up on top. And in most cases, like you mentioned, wars are started with a degree of optimism, as I have written, which then unravels. And despite a preponderance of military power, uh, two things usually contribute greater than most other factors. One is a level of irrational optimism on the side that is initiating the conflict, and the second is the difficulty or the lack of attention paid to two or three aspects as far as the adversary goes. That is there a gap between the nature of the war as one side sees it, and the nature of the war as the other side, the defenders perhaps in this case, see the whole thing as a matter of survival, for which they are willing to pay a much higher price than might have been envisaged by the initiator in this case, or in many other cases. So therefore, the ability of smaller nations, smaller groups to fight back can be underestimated. And therefore, uh, like so many people try and explain, that one of the first the things we can miss out while crafting our own strategy is to imagine what sort of strategy the enemy might have, and to think of that, which is surprising because all of planning at the level of statecraft as well as at the level of military craft talks about first evaluating a whole lot of factors, thereafter trying to determine what are the enemy courses of action, what is the worst that the enemy can do to us, despite internal decisions having been taken that let us initiate this war, let it be a war of choice because we are likely to achieve certain objectives. We are not going into the politics of these objectives or the morality of these objectives or the legality of these objectives, just as an intellectual exercise. And therefore,
True.
the aspect of operational art becomes very important to bring in. And operational art is largely an art where you try and figure out at the strategic level of statecraft, at the strategic level of military matters, and at the operational and to a slightly lesser extent at the tactical level, how operational art can be leveraged to come out uh, better off than the other side.
True. But if the planning was better, and I'm sure there are in recent and ancient history, there are examples of what good planning can do or better planning can do. Do you have any examples to share with our viewers, which shows that when you plan the aggression of plan the initiation of a conflict well or better, then the results are better or they are swifter and to the liking of the initiator, because that will illustrate how things can go wrong if the planning is not adequate.
Yes, I think a few examples, perhaps, I'll try and enumerate them briefly. One is, of course, the India-Pakistan 1971 war, which created a new nation with great amount of participation by the rebel forces, the freedom fighters in East Pakistan, which was to become a new country, Bangladesh. And from the beginning, I think there is now, more and more archival information coming out that both the political side, and within that, I use the term, the foreign service, the diplomatic side, including a very a fine, proactive foreign affairs minister like Sardar Swaran Singh, who had figured out a whole lot of issues that would be relevant. One, I think it was by around the spring of 1971, it was becoming clearer that perhaps some military intervention by India would be necessary to help the rebels, the freedom fighters in East Pakistan, who of whom Mukti Bahini was the largest group, to be able to uh, harness their resources together with help from India. And therefore, the preparatory time was required for this. It was also a period where diplomatically India was at a great disadvantage, with the US having completely on the side of Pakistan, and of course at that time involved in Vietnam itself, and all the Cold War realities and rhetoric existed, where India was thought to be part of uh, the the socialist camp, so to speak, which we were not, of course, but that resulted in a whole lot of new alignments, and we needed the time. So the factor of time to use space as well as force carefully was something that the political and military establishments together had worked out. And in this, of course, the readiness of the Indian armed forces was the aim, but that would have also taken time. So, of course, Field Marshal Manekshaw's stand on not hurrying into military operations is well known, but it was duly supported and understood by the political establishment also. Uh, so, therefore, what could have possibly been the need in May or June in 1971 was for a host of reasons envisaged for November or December 1971. As it happened, um, despite small skirmishes that were taking place in Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, um, it was Pakistan that actually opened the hostilities on the third, fourth night. But yes,
Third,
opening
yes.
salvos, that's right. But we were prepared for it. Another example, which is not a great one, was perhaps the IPKF, the Indian involvement in Sri Lanka as a result of the accords and the requests made by Sri Lankans, and the very confusing strategic picture, the very hasty compilation of the what is called intelligence preparation of the battle space. And when I say battle space, I do not mean it only in a military sense, but indeed in the political diplomatic sense. We ought to have done better. We had the time. The peacekeeping or the peace enforcement operations and the disarming operations could have been better planned for better success. And it also meant that we needed to understand the LTTE a lot better, their motivations, their strategy, as well as the contradictory aspects of Sri Lankan strategies. And there, at that stage, at that point of time in 86, 87, they're very ambiguous positions on a lot of things. So I think we, despite having time, we hastened into something with what I have used the word an irrational level of optimism within both the political as well as military establishments. So these
You
are the
say
two examples.
you say irrational optimism. I say overconfidence because and of course confused objectives because the military didn't know whether it had gone there as a peacekeeping force and then turned into a kind of law enforcer or enforcer for peace, which the LTT was very clear that it wasn't going to accept from anyone, neither the Sri Lankan army nor the Indians. So I think that was a disaster. But just one point about 71 before I go to my next query about operational art and other stuff. Even in 71, there was one more aspect that was taken care of very well, and that was to create uh, a feeling across the world that this was a just war, a war that was justified because of the atrocities, because of the humanitarian crisis that the Pakistani army had created in East Pakistan. And therefore, it was incumbent upon India, which was at the receiving end of the steady flow of refugees, as well as the misery it was seeing. And that was done very well in terms of coordinating the media coverage, the perception management, all that. In fact, I consider in the Indian context that is the best example of planning well in advance the perception management campaign, along with other preparation that was done by the Indian state. But that notwithstanding, what is your view about what happened in Kargil, for instance? India was on a back foot in the initial weeks, but after that, India did manage to sort of get into a position of strength. And even a recent example over the past couple of years with China. If you could elaborate about in the context of what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, if you can tell us that.
Uh, Nitin, you made a very good point about just wars and the 1971 being a very good example from the Indian perspective. But I may add here that in that very famous book, Just and Unjust Wars, by the ethicist and military historian Michael Walzer, he mentions, in fact, the 1971 war that led to the liberation of Bangladesh as one of the finest international and perennial examples of a just war. And that is and he examines all these aspects in great detail before coming to that. uh, in terms of Kargil, uh, perhaps you are the better person to explain this, having been physically present there. I was a mid-level officer that time in a ship, and we were ready, of course, uh, to go into hostilities if the war escalated into the maritime domain, and we were deployed accordingly. But in Kargil, I think Musharraf did achieve uh, a strategic surprise and operational surprise. Uh, and I would say that it might have been war gamed earlier. It might, scenarios like this might have been envisaged. There are some reports that some of it was done. But this is where I think armed forces also need to constantly look at various scenarios, contingencies. What's the worst that can happen to us, and in that circumstances, what's the best that we can do? And this is actually the nub of operational art, or what is called the commander's estimate of the situation. And therefore, as I have suggested, it is not only for the commander but across all ropes of statecraft. And here you could say that, say, a portal or an agency like the Strategic News Global itself looks after all these verticals: the diplomatic, informational, intelligence, military, and economic, the dime, so to speak, to make it phonetically a little
Sure.
clearer for students of warfare like us, or diplomacy, and for generally students everywhere. So it is the dime construct where, on the one hand, we can get into problems if we have vertical, if they are treated as verticals without the horizontal interactions and the layering, that is, interactions that are required. So therefore, the verticals acquire strength only when the horizontals speak a lot to each other, interact between themselves, and that is the essence of, I think, the statecraft that was good in 1971, not so great in 86, 87. Again, in Kargil, despite the initial surprises, I think we got our act together quite well. And yet, uh, let's not forget that it was a fairly local operation.
It was.
Considering how long the India-Pakistan border is, it was localized, and statecraft ensured that it remained localized. And yet, I think, in the military sense, from what one read later, we were found wanting and panting in a little way in some ways. And you, as an eyewitness there, would have probably seen this more, and you can add to that, which shouldn't
Yes.
have happened. We should have been able to take that contingency in our stride without running into without feeling exhausted about ammunition or other wherewithal, and with the initial planning not having been done, how to use most of our instruments. Uh, this is something, how to use the instruments is important, and that needs to be continued. Whether to use or not are political decisions that need to be taken. But once political decisions are taken, I think we should not be in a fix now to determine how to use those instruments. Those That
I
kind
agree.
of contingency planning, wargaming, is very important for the armed forces, and not only armed forces, I would say, across the dime. That means, how do we do a whole of government wargaming? And it is done from time to time in all countries, I'm sure, within the inner circles of government. but it needs to be done with a lot greater honesty and integrity of approach, and which you can see, say, in some other examples which are not so good, like imposition of economic sanctions, for instance, that has happened in the Russian war, like you were mentioning. How does it relate to the current issues that the world is living with? And economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia perhaps were more knee jerk than well thought out, planned, because in many cases, the people or the agencies which supported or thought of these sanctions perhaps hadn't done thinking, as I mentioned earlier, of what countermeasures, counter strategies might say Russia have in this case.
Oh, yes.
And Russia also took certain countermeasures. And that is to be expected. The enemy or the adversary, in that sense, a name for the other side, uh,
Right.
is also
Absolutely.
not going to sit idle and continue suffering. Will try to fight back as successfully as they can, or sometimes unsuccessfully.
In fact, the West would have learned by now in 1 year that its sanctions, economic sanctions, haven't really worked. And Russia, in fact, its economy remains robust thanks to the sale of oil, inexpensive, let me not call it cheap oil, but inexpensive oil, and which it is using strategically, both to the biggest consumers of petroleum products in the world, China and India. So that perhaps was not factored in, right, like you rightly said. But one final thought about Russia and Ukraine, to come back to it. There have been some thoughts about how Russia hasn't really brought in its full firepower, and it is sort of holding back the air power, for instance, in Ukraine, and also doesn't have the heart or the stomach for going beyond certain areas that it wants under its control, just to push back the NATO presence or the borders of Ukraine. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, was it a limited objective operation, or do you think we are at a stage where Russia might relaunch an offensive and then go forward?
Uh, to go back to the first part, it is still difficult to say. One can, at best guess about what the Russian strategic level planning was, what were their strategic objectives. In Mr. Putin's speech, I think he talked about denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, but those are a bit too subjective to be translated into attainable objectives. Uh,
Sure.
through military force as the primary instrument in this case. Also, I would say that it seems that uh, there was some level of confusion about what the objectives were,
Exactly.
what were the political outcomes that were required. Initially, it seemed as if Kiev was an objective, and therefore, maneuvers through Belarusia might also have been have happened, or columns came very close and then retreated. So it seemed to observers that there was a high degree of sort of knee jerk or haphazard uh, planning that you could see in those actions. If it were the gaining control over the eastern portions of Ukraine, which were the more disputed areas, then why was it not concentrated? And you're right in posing these questions. Three principles of war, that we have studied from our youngest days in the armed forces: selection and maintenance of aim, concentration of force, and economy of effort. Now, economy of effort and concentration of force, of course, uh, are seemingly contradictory, but they are not actually. You should achieve the objectives with as much force as required to achieve those objectives. The point is that when you're fighting in areas like this, or according to the Russians, they claimed part of eastern Ukraine as Russian territory because of Russian speakers, then there are obviously limits to the amount of force you can use, whether it would have become a Pyrrhic victory by destroying the whole area and uh, creating a lot of death and carnage there. So, what would have been the worthiness of that political objective, or that physical objective, if the political objectives were made worse in the process. So therefore, one has to be very careful in using the degree of force that is required, because you should not devastate another place to an extent where uh, it becomes counterproductive. In this case, of
True.
course, Russian confusion seem to be very high. I do not know how it might play out, um, but the temptation could be for Russians to use more and more force, greater force, uh, uh, in receding objectives, and that might provide further sort of setbacks. And especially now that military aid to Ukraine is seems to be on the upswing, um, uh, perhaps this war can go back into waves of greater and medium intensity, with some phases of low intensity. But one doesn't know, because both sides seem to be now reaching what could be one of the issues of a long war that operational art teaches us. It's called culminating points of victory, or a culminating point of defeat. So it remains to be seen what do people do, or whether uh, the 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 stalemate like environment that it sometimes seems, where either side is unable to uh, take the objectives that they might have publicly stated, or defend their positions, uh, might make therefore uh, an environment in which negotiations could seem a little more attractive to
It's
both
like a
sides.
trap which they've got into, and now they don't know where to retreat from their maximalist positions, perhaps. But we will see what goes ahead, and what comes up in the coming months. We still don't know what the outcome would be, but the world is, of course, watching very closely. It is suffering in various ways, and this 1 year seems quite long in what has happened in the past 12 months. But we will see what happens. But this was a very interesting discussion. I think we've had. Now it completes our objective of doing discussions across time, as you mentioned, because we've had diplomats speaking to us, analysts speaking to us, people who have watched Russia from very close quarters have spoken to us over the past 1 week. But today, this completes the actual details of waging a war and the instruments of war and how they are employed by either side in a conflict. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. Wonderful as usual.
Thank you very much, Nitin.
Pleasure. So, viewers, we wanted this discussion to be a little technical because in any conflict there are various aspects, as you've seen over the past 1 week. We've got experts from the diplomatic community. We've got analysts from think tanks like the IISS, and practitioners of diplomacy who've spoken to us about what they think about the Russia-Ukraine war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and 1 year later. But there was one small part missing, and that was about a military aspect of it, or the military domain, how it has panned out over the past 1 year or so, and that's why this discussion. I hope you like this discussion. Do keep watching Strat News Global. You know where to reach us. Do send feedback. And of course, our social media handles. Follow them. And if you already follow them, spread the word. We would be happy to receive suggestions and feedback going forward through every medium possible. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.